Hey folks, welcome back to HeartGold vs. Crystal. We are here at the Elite Four, the second member, and we are taking on Koga, the master of poison types. Now, Koga should be familiar to a lot of you people, because Koga was originally a gym leader in Generation 1, but sometime between Generation 1 and Generation 2, he got promoted to an Elite Four member, even though he wasn't even the strongest gym leader in Kanto. I don't know their selection process. Anyway, as I said, Koga is a master of poison types, which means that your psychic types will have a field day here, and to a lesser extent, the ground types. I say a lesser extent because there are a couple Pokemon that just don't really care for your ground type moves, like Earthquake. Pretty good move, but there's one Pokemon in particular that just will not have any of that. But regardless, Sandra with a Sword Stance up, using a Stabbed Earthquake, super effective most likely, is going to do a lot of damage to a lot of things. But what it won't do a lot of damage to is this Fortress, which, despite Koga's theme, is in fact not a poison type. It is a Bug Steel type, and I actually considered using it for this playthrough. I eventually opted to use Frida instead, but it was on the list for quite a while. It's also a pain in the butt to get. But like most steel types, it has pretty darn high physical defense, which makes that Earthquake, despite being boosted, only a 2 KO. It's dangerous, and it probably can explode. It likes to do that in various other situations, so I assume this one can as well. Anywho, now we have Venomoth. Venomoth is a bug poison, and I have stated before that I should totally use one at some point. But they're pretty cool. And despite flying, it is actually weak to ground type moves, so let's have more Sandra Earthquake action. Doing well so far, but Sandra's a little low on health. Then Muck. Muck is a pure poison type, and for the life of me, I don't know what it really excels at, except I think it's relatively bulky. One thing it can do, however, is poison you, which is mean. And it, I believe, in this generation has a special ability called, like, Toxic Ooze or something along those lines, that makes any sort of health-sapping move, like a Giga Drain or Leech Seed or the like, actually do damage to the person receiving the absorbed energy, which is rather mean if you're not expecting it. Of course, ground type moves don't play by those rules, so Muck goes down. Isn't this such a nice variation from the from just Umbreon doing everything? Anyway, his last Pokemon is Crobat, and if you've been using a ground type up until now, here's where your streak kind of ends. Because Crobat, unfortunately, is part flying type, and that means that your ground type moves do not affect it. So, stuck using a much weaker move, Slash. No stab, no super effective. Possibility of a critical. It does have a high critical hit ratio, as you can see there, but that's not reliable. And I have this thing about Crobats. They're supposed to be fragile, like relatively fragile, but they never seem to be as fragile as I expect them to be, which is very unfortunate. But as you can see, this guy is pretty close to going down. I just need to be patient, basically. As you can see, he's not doing a lot of damage. Crobat is well known as what people call an annoyer, which, as the name describes, essentially annoys you. It'll like use Double Team or something to avoid you. It will confuse you. It'll do all sorts of other heinous things. It's basically there to be a pain in the ass. Anyway, let's use Bree. Now, Bree actually had the possibility of being useful against that Fortress, because Fortress, being Bug Steel, is quadruple weak to Flamethrower. But I decided that I wanted to keep the Sword Stance sweep going, so I opted not to do that. But Bree probably could have done a good job against a lot of Koga's Pokemon using the Psychic-type move Extrasensory, which is super effective. And that takes care of Koga. Relatively easy compared to Will, or at least less tedious, since I have Pokemon that are actually useful against him other than Everett, so that's nice. Anywho, time for the Crystal fight. Now, the Crystal fight is actually going to be a little bit more difficult in this version, which is surprising, considering kind of the advantage it's had in many other fights, thanks to the bad AI. But here, the kind of the clincher here, both Bree doesn't have Extrasensory, and Sandra doesn't have Swords Dance. So that means no Psychic-type moves, and Earthquake is weaker. And lo and behold, Bree's Flying-type move, which is super effective against these Bug-types, isn't actually even a 2KO, which stinks. So overall, I'm just doing less damage to all of his Pokemon. And of course I don't have Flamethrower to use against that Fortress either. That's getting ahead of myself. But as you can see, even busting out the metronome in hopes that it'll help me out. And I really could use that Flame Wheel against the Fortress, not against the stupid Ariados. Inferior Ariados. Bottom percentage of all Ariados. Now that rollout actually could have been useful. Rollout being a Rock-type move, super effective against Bug, would have been neutral against the Fortress and would have grown in power had it worked. It didn't. Overall, my only strategy against this Fortress is to bring in Sandra, because that metronome is far, far too unreliable. If I managed to get, like, Fire Blast from it, everything would be golden. But that didn't happen. So it's up to Sandra to break out the Earthquakes and see what happens. But here we have Fortress's annoying strategy, which it did employ a little bit in HeartGold, is Protect. Protect is basically a move that prevents a given move from working. Like, it blocks the user from whatever the opponent uses that turn. So it's an excellent way to stall the opponent if they're using low PP moves. I assume it also has other uses in the metagame. I could see it as a whittling technique if you have, like, Poison and Leech Seed on the opponent, although that won't happen in the metagame very much. Things like that. But here, I'm going to desperate measures. Let's go for Klaus. What can Klaus do that Sandra cannot? Well, you'll see in just a sec. But hopefully it'll work out. Because this Fortress, again, it's not dangerous. It's just annoying as hell. But basically, I wanted to preserve the Earthquakes on Sandra because those are very precious. And so I'm switching over to Klaus to use the special type move Surf, which will hopefully prey off Fortress's not so great special defense stat. And it works. It hits fairly well. It has more PP than Earthquake slightly. But it's still not a great solution. I mean, Surf is by no means optimal. And again, bringing pretty much any sort of fire move to this encounter will almost utterly trivialize it, I would bet, since Fortress doesn't do so well against fire-type moves, especially in this generation, where there are no physical fire-type moves. But instead, let's whittle. And as you can see, we spent almost as long on this one... There's Explosion, by the way. Almost as long on this one Fortress as we have on the entirety of Koga and HeartGold. So, yeah. Anyway, Explosion, dangerous thing, does dangerous damage, will probably faint whatever you try to bring in. Unless it's a ghost type. Anyway, Ariados comes back in, and since I'm not expecting it to do a whole lot of damage, I'm going to take this opportunity to heal and get myself up to better position. Oh yeah, that Giga Drain. It's super effective, but how much is it really gonna do, guys? Oh, actually quite a bit. Well, egg on my face then. But luckily, hopefully, Sandra, yes, is indeed faster than the Ariados. So, although it's not as optimal a position to get into the next Pokemon as I would like, it's still better than where I was before. And here we have the Venomoth again. Venomoth, I don't think has changed too much. What ability does it have in Gen 4? Like, Compound Eyes won't lose accuracy? I don't see that happening much. But again, since Ree doesn't have any tools other than Fly against these guys, Sandra is kind of my best option against all these guys. And I'd like to keep her alive, if at all possible. There we have Toxic, which is especially unfortunate on Bree, since I'm... oh god, Gust too. Since Fly is a 2-turn move, Toxic will get progressively worse, and I will get less damage in per amount of health lost to Toxic. And then that move Gust that was just used, I didn't even know until playing this, actually hits especially hard against Pokemon who are currently flying. Like, it's kind of like using Earthquake on a Pokemon using Dig, except Gust isn't as good a move as Earthquake, and you'll never see it in the metagame, but it's still, goodness gracious, an unpleasant twist for me. Anyway, Sandra's out, Bree is out, Klaus is out. What are we gonna do? We're gonna bring in our own poison types. What do we got? We have Dig. Dig, honestly, not a terrible idea. It was my go-to ground move for quite a while, so it could work, I guess. But that's still no help against Crobat, and as you can see, the bug type of Venomoth cancels out the ground type advantage, apparently. And it appears that Webster and Venomoth actually here have a speed tie, so I managed to get lucky and dodge a Psychic there. But then Psychic hits again, and Psychic, of course, is super effective against Webster. And even from this Venomoth that doesn't get stabbed from it, it's gonna do a lot of damage. So what do we have left? We have Frida and we have Everett. We have our two Whittlers, our two walls, basically. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that stunning? Isn't that exciting? I wish I didn't have to resort to these guys so much. We got a lot of good screen time from the rest of the dudes in the HeartGold fight and previous parts of this fight, but kind of some of the most crazy Pokemon on Koga's team have to go down to our designated dudes here. Now, Frida, you may have been yelling at me in the comments earlier for saying, "Oh, I don't have any Psychic-type moves here in Crystal," when I do on Frida, but that's not a great thing, because Koga's a Poison-type user, and Frida is weak to Poison. And that's just not a good thing to do. Anyway, watch me abuse the fact that it's Crystal and there are no abilities, so that I can, in fact, set up Leech Seed. That's kind of the devastating thing in HeartGold. You can't inflict poison because it's a poison type, and you can't put on Leech Seed because it has the Toxic Ooze. That's dangerous here. We can at least somewhat slip into our whittling ways. And that Confusion did a pretty good amount of damage. All in all, it looks like the Leech Seed was overall unnecessary. But still, this could be dangerous. If that initial Sleep Powder hadn't worked out, that would have been a bad situation for Frida. And now Crobat. Crobat, of course, is just all kinds of bad news for Frida, since it is a Poison type, which is good against the Grass type, and it is a Flying type, which is strong against the Grass type. So, that's not so great. And just, of course, because everything is terrible, Confusion isn't quite a 2KO on this supposedly fragile Pokemon. And now it's going to go into the red, and it's going to use some sort of max potion or something, and it's just going to be totally unfortunate. And if this stalls on too much longer, Toxic is going to get much, much worse. I talked about Toxic as in something I would love to have, and something that the opponents are using against me. But sooner or later, I'm gonna have it on my side, and they will rue the day that they gave me Toxic. Anyway, let's check out how much damage this wing attack does. Dangerous amounts, considering. Frida is supposed to be a good defensive Pokemon, so seeing that wing attack do that much damage scared me a little bit. But then I remember I still had Everett in reserve, and all my fears were alleviated, because this Crobat ain't doing nothing to Everett. It's a simple fact of life. Everett cannot be killed by conventional weapons. I mean, he's poisoned, he had the spikes thing, but all that is simply not an issue to this guy. And Crobat goes down. That fight certainly wore us down quite a bit more than the HeartGold version. And although I was never really in danger because I had Everett in reserve, it was a fair bit more challenging. Anyway, that takes care of Koga, and we'll fight the next member of the Elite Four next time.